In the dimly lit halls of a medieval monastery, a young woman named Radegund stood before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer. She had forsaken the world of luxury and power to embrace a life of monastic devotion, but the road to sanctity was paved with unexpected trials. According to the hagiographer Venantius Fortunatus, Radegund's transition from a royal princess to a consecrated monacha, a term that, while feminine, was not the usual word for nun, was marked by a deep spiritual transformation. Her journey was one of many that would shape the lives of women in the Dark Ages, as they navigated a world where religious devotion often entailed profound personal sacrifice. Sainted women of the Dark Ages, as chronicled by scholars like Joanne McNamara and John H. Halborg, faced a complex interplay of societal expectations and personal aspirations. For Radegund, her decision to become a monacha was a bold statement of her commitment to a higher calling. Similarly, Balthild, a former slave who rose to become the Queen of the Franks, found her true calling in a life of religious service. Her story, as recorded in the life of Balthild, illustrates the transformative power of monastic life, where women could escape the confines of secular society and find a new sense of purpose. However, the path to sanctity was not without its challenges. Medieval society was rife with sexual taboos and moral codes that often led to harsh judgments and stringent regulations. The early penitentials, as studied by Aaron V, Abraham and Pierre J. Payer, reveal the strict guidelines imposed on monastic communities, particularly concerning sexual behavior. These texts, which served as guides for confessors, detailed the penances required for various sins, including those of a sexual nature. The laws and societal norms of the time, as explored by James Brundage, reflect a deep concern with maintaining the purity and sanctity of the clergy and monastic orders. The lives of these holy women were often marked by a profound sense of otherness. Scholars like Jacobus de Voragine, in his Golden Legend, portrayed saints as being set apart from the world, their lives a testament to divine grace and human striving. Yet the reality was more complex. In the Carolingian monastery, as recounted by Albrecht Diem, the lines between spiritual and physical purity were often blurred, leading to stories of temptation and resistance. The Visio Wetini, a visionary account by Wellafrid Strabo and Heito, offers a glimpse into the internal struggles of monastic life, where the battle against sin was a constant and often fraught endeavor. The concept of gender itself was fluid in medieval Christianity. Theodore of Staudios, a prominent theologian, wrote about the complex nature of human desire in his Magna Catechesis. His teachings, as translated by Peter Hatley, suggest that the pursuit of holiness often required a rejection of traditional gender roles. This idea was further explored by Abelard in his letters to Helois, where he grappled with the tension between his monastic vows and his deep love for her. The notion of a third gender, or a genderless state, as suggested by scholars like Aaron Swanson and Joanne McNamara, highlights the ways in which medieval thinkers conceptualized the spiritual life as a realm beyond conventional gender boundaries. The lives of these holy women were not just about personal transformation. They also had a profound impact on the broader society. In the Byzantine world, as discussed by Catherine M. Ringrose, eunuchs played a significant role in the social and religious landscape. Their unique position, often seen as a third gender, allowed them to occupy spaces that were otherwise inaccessible to men or women. The eunuch's role in Byzantine society, as detailed in Ringrose's work, underscores the complexity of medieval gender norms and the ways in which religious institutions shaped these norms. As the medieval world evolved, so too did the understanding of gender and sexuality. The reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries, as studied by Helen Parrish and Joanne McNamara, brought about significant changes in the lives of clergy and monastics. The push for clerical celibacy, as detailed by Jennifer D. Thibodeaux, was not just a moral imperative, but also a means of asserting control over the religious hierarchy. The struggle for celibacy, however, was often met with resistance, as evidenced by the stories of clerics who defied these strictures. The lives of medieval holy women from Radegund to Balthild were marked by a profound sense of purpose and a deep commitment to their faith. Their stories, as preserved in the annals of hagiography, offer a window into a world where the boundaries of gender and sexuality were constantly being negotiated. In the shadow of the altar, These women found a path to sanctity that transcended the limitations of their time, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us today. In medieval times, the idea of having children within marriage was seen as a way to justify the act of sex, which was often viewed as potentially sinful. Marriage was a common expectation in society, even though not everyone got married. Some people entered religious life, couldn't afford to marry, or simply chose not to. Despite these exceptions, marriage was generally considered the default option, and being married or not was often how people were categorized in terms of their sexual activity. The church, which usually set the rules about marriage and sex, was often run by people who were not married themselves. They taught that marriage was the only acceptable place for sex, but they also believed that chastity was better. This created a paradox. While marriage was expected, it was also seen as a second-best choice compared to a life of celibacy. Despite this, the church used marriage as a metaphor in many religious teachings, such as comparing Christ's relationship with the church to a marriage. The concept of marriage itself was more complex in the Middle Ages than it is today. Modern marriage is defined by specific legal rules, but medieval people had various types of long-term relationships that didn't always fit neatly into our modern categories. For example, early medieval kings often had multiple sexual partners, but only one was considered the legal wife. The church tried to standardize marriage by the 12th century, making it a formal, church-sanctioned union. This meant that children born outside of such marriages were often considered illegitimate and couldn't inherit property. The church also had strict rules about who could marry whom. They prohibited marriages between people who were closely related, up to 7 degrees of kinship. This included both blood relatives and relatives by marriage. These rules were so restrictive that they often made it difficult for people to find suitable partners, especially among the aristocracy. By the 12th century, the church simplified this to 4 degrees, making it more manageable. However, if a couple found out they were too closely related after getting married, they could ask the church to annul the marriage. Another important aspect of medieval marriage was that it was generally considered indissoluble. Once married, couples were expected to stay together, and divorce was rarely allowed. The only way to end a marriage was to prove it was never valid in the first place, such as if one party was already married, or if they were too closely related. This was a significant change from earlier practices, where wealthy and powerful men could often set aside their wives and take new ones. The church's influence on marriage and sex was profound. It shaped how people thought about relationships and defined what was acceptable behavior. Even though not everyone followed these rules, they were a powerful force in medieval society, affecting everything from family dynamics to legal rights and inheritance. Despite the church's strict views, many people still found ways to form relationships and have children outside of these formal, church-sanctioned marriages. By the 13th century, the rules about marriage in Christian Europe were well established and consistent across different regions. These rules came from the Catholic Church, and they were based on collections of papal decrees that everyone accepted as the standard. However, while the overall guidelines were the same, local churches and synods applied these rules differently. For example, the church said that you couldn't remarry if your first spouse was still alive, but different places had different standards for proving that a spouse had died. People brought different types of cases to church courts. Some were brought by women who claimed they were married, even though their partners denied it. Others were brought by both men and women who wanted to end a marriage because they believed it was never valid in the first place. Church officials also sometimes brought cases to discipline people who got married in ways that didn't follow the rules. One of the most important principles in medieval marriage law was that a marriage was binding and permanent if both partners consented to it, even if the wedding wasn't performed in a church or blessed by a priest, or even if the parents didn't agree. This rule was especially important for marriages that didn't produce children, as it emphasized that consent, not just having children, was what made a marriage legitimate. While the church enforced strict marriage rules for Christians, these rules didn't apply to Muslims and Jews. Both Islam and Judaism allowed men to have multiple wives, but women could only have one husband. In Jewish tradition, the marriage contract ketubah sometimes included a promise from the husband that he wouldn't marry another wife. Jewish men could divorce their wives, but women couldn't initiate a divorce. In one interesting case, a Jewish couple in 13th century Seville converted to Christianity to get the woman out of her marriage. Among Ashkenazic Jews in Western Europe, an ordinance attributed to Rabbi Gershom ben Judah of Mainz in the 11th century banned polygamy and required a husband to get his wife's consent before divorcing her. This ban on polygamy was likely influenced by the Christian culture around them, which taught that marriage was permanent. Even though only husbands could initiate a divorce, the community could pressure them to do so, especially if the husband was behaving badly. For example, in 13th century Ashkenaz, rabbis could force a man to divorce his wife if he was frequently visiting sex workers. Muslim marriage laws were different from Christian ones. Men could marry up to 4 wives and have concubines, but they had to be able to support all of them. In practice, only wealthier men could afford multiple wives. Muslim law also recognized the contradiction in allowing men to have multiple sexual partners while women couldn't, but the main reason for this was to avoid confusion about paternity. Men could unilaterally divorce their wives, but this often involved negotiations with the wife's family and could cause financial difficulties for the husband. Some women included clauses in their marriage contracts that gave them the right to force their husbands to divorce them, or to forbid their husbands from taking additional wives or concubines. In the Mamluk Empire, divorce was common enough that the authorities established communal houses called ribats for divorced or widowed women who couldn't support themselves. These houses were similar to the beguines and tertiaries in Western Europe, where women lived together in a religious and communal setting. Muslim men were allowed to marry non-Muslim women, which was not the case in Judaism and Christianity. Inter-religious marriages were sometimes used as a way for new Muslim rulers to integrate with local communities, especially in Iberia. For example, the Arab governor of Al-Andalus married the widow of the Visigothic king Roderic's daughter. These marriages allowed the new rulers to connect with local customs and secure land and alliances. However, such marriages became less common over time, and Christians often portrayed them in literature as stories where a beautiful Saracen woman was rescued, converted, and married to a Christian man. The possibility of divorce affected how people thought about marital sex. In Muslim society, contraception was acceptable, and one reason given was that if a man might divorce his wife, he should avoid having children with her. In contrast, Christians believed that if you didn't want children, you shouldn't have sex at all. These rules about marriage and sex were part of the broader social and legal systems that governed medieval life. The balance of power within a marriage depended on both individual personalities and the cultural norms of the time. Medieval church teaching and literature generally agreed that the man was the head of the household and the woman should obey him. Even writers who were sympathetic to women, like Christine de Pizan, acknowledged this hierarchy but argued that women could still exert influence over their husbands. For example, a princess could advise her husband and petition him on behalf of the people, but she had to do so humbly and obediently. Women who achieved political power, like Ermengarde of Narbonne, were often widows, as married women usually couldn't hold land or enter into business contracts on their own. In some places, women could only inherit land if they had no brothers, and even then, control over the land went to their husbands. In many parts of Europe, there were no legal consequences for a man who beat his wife, as long as he didn't kill her. Literature from the period often depicted unruly or insubordinate wives, but it's hard to know how medieval people interpreted these stories. Some might have seen these women as clever and strong, while others might have seen them as examples of why women should be obedient. For instance, one story tells of a woman who always disobeyed her husband and fell into a river because she moved away from where he told her to sit. Another story shows a woman refusing to help her husband when he fell into the fire, which some might see as cruel, but others might interpret as a lesson about the consequences of a man's stubbornness. In Jewish tradition, a woman who refused to have sex with her husband was called a mordet. Initially, rabbis required the husband to divorce such a woman, but over time, they began to encourage men to grant their wives a divorce if the women wanted one. This shift was partly to prevent women from seeking help from non-Jewish courts. Across all religious cultures, marriage was closely tied to sex and reproduction. While people got married for love, companionship, and economic reasons, Most writing about marriage emphasized that it was a way to legitimize sex and ensure the continuity of the family line. A Frankish church council in 829 stated that marriage should be for the sake of having children, not just for pleasure, and that sex should be avoided with a pregnant wife. Despite the legal and cultural norms that placed men in a dominant position, medieval society didn't expect women to be completely submissive. The marital relationship was not one of equals, but it wasn't one of master and slave either. Husbands were expected to be in charge, but they were also expected to be reasonable and considerate of their wives' needs. In medieval times, the role of children and their legitimacy was incredibly important. This meant that husbands had to tightly control their wives' sexual activities to ensure the children were truly theirs. The ability to reproduce was so crucial that accusations of not having sex with one's wife could be used to undermine a king's rule. For example, such claims were made against King Edward II of England and his wife Isabella of France, as well as King Enrique IV of Castile and his wives. These stories were often political critiques rather than factual reports, reflecting the public nature of royal marriages and how harmony within them symbolized the stability of the realm. Medieval people often thought of sex primarily in terms of reproduction. Their understanding of reproduction was heavily influenced by the works of Aristotle, who believed that men provided the seed for conception, while women provided the material. However, not everyone agreed with Aristotle. In early medieval times, Arabic medical texts, following Galen, held that both men and women produced seed, and women's pleasure was seen as crucial for conception. Women were thought to have strong sexual appetites, which was seen as beneficial for reproduction. Over time, Aristotle's theories became more dominant, leading to a view of women as passive in intercourse, shaped by the idea that they provided inert matter for the man's seed to form into a child. The importance of reproduction led to a focus on promoting marital fertility. Medical texts from the 12th century onward contained detailed advice on how to make women conceive. Historians once thought this advice was secretly about contraception, but Monica Green argues that it was genuinely about fertility. These texts identified various medical conditions in men and women that could prevent conception and recommended remedies like baths, diets, and sexual techniques to promote the release of female seed. By the 15th century, male physicians were taking a more hands-on approach to gynecology, while Secrets of Women texts, which were more speculative and often misogynistic, also discussed fertility and reproductive anatomy. Marriage was essential for the survival of society, but there was ongoing debate about the moral status of sexual activity. The tension between valuing virginity and valuing marriage persisted throughout the Middle Ages. The balance shifted depending on factors like population needs, heresies, and political context. For instance, in the late 11th and 12th centuries, the Church placed more value on marriage as part of its efforts to control many aspects of lay life. This shift was partly a response to heresies like Catharism, which saw the body and reproduction as evil. The Church emphasized the sacramental nature of marriage to counter these views, arguing that marital sex was not only permissible, but also part of a sacred union. The Church's control over marriage also had political implications. Secular lords needed sons to continue their line, and if a couple did not have sons, the woman was often blamed. However, by the 11th century, the Church began to assert its authority over marriage, refusing to allow secular lords to repudiate their wives. The Church allowed some marriages to be dissolved, like that of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine, but this was to assert its own power over marriage decisions. In the later Middle Ages, the Church faced new challenges, including a demographic crisis and anti-clericalism. The Black Death and subsequent population decline led governments to promote marriage and reproduction. In Florence, for example, a municipal brothel was established to encourage men to marry and have children. The Church also faced criticism from heresies like Lollardism, which questioned the value of the clergy's celibacy. In response, the Church began to emphasize the value of marriage and the family, seeing it as a microcosm of the divine order. More married people were venerated as saints, and stories about virtuous married individuals became more common. While reproduction was central to medieval ideas about marriage, it was not the only justification. Theologians like Augustine identified three goods of marriage: offspring, faithfulness, and the sacrament. By the 12th century, the sacramentality of marriage was defined, with Christ's participation in the wedding at Cana being seen as the establishment of the sacrament. There was a debate over what made a valid marriage, with some arguing that consummation was necessary and others, like Peter Lombard, arguing that mutual consent was sufficient. Lombard's view prevailed, allowing for the validity of unconsummated marriages like that of Mary and Joseph. Despite the focus on reproduction, medieval society recognized that not all marriages would produce children. Therefore, other aspects of marriage, such as mutual love and the sacramental bond, were also emphasized to validate these unions. This nuanced understanding of marriage reflects the complex interplay of religious, social, and political factors that shaped medieval attitudes toward sexuality and family. As the centuries passed, the Church's view on marriage and sexual relations evolved, influenced by the practical challenges of daily life and the deepening of religious doctrine. In the 11th century, Ivo of Chartres proposed that a man treating his concubine as his wife could make their relationship a marriage. However, it was the concept of consent that became the cornerstone of marriage in the eyes of the Church. Words of present consent, such as "I take you as my wife," created a valid marriage immediately. Future or conditional consent, like "I will take you as my wife if my father agrees," did not form a marriage until sexual intercourse occurred, which was seen as a way of dropping the condition. While a marriage did not need to be consummated to be valid, it had to be open to the possibility of sexual intercourse. If one party was incapable of having sex, the marriage could be dissolved. To determine this, a jury of women, sometimes even sex workers, might be called to examine the physical capabilities of the man or woman. In one case, a witness described a man's penis as being scarcely 3 inches long, causing the women to curse him for defrauding his young wife. In another, the man's penis was described as large enough for any woman living in this world, suggesting that sexual satisfaction was a concern in these examinations. The idea of impotence caused by magic became common in the 12th century. If a man or woman was impotent only with their spouse, it was often attributed to a spell, and the marriage was considered valid. The couple would have to attempt to remove the spell through confession, prayer, and other magical or medical remedies. This belief was not limited to Christian scholars. It also appeared in literature, such as in Engel's Saga, where a man's impotence was attributed to a spell cast by a queen he had an affair with. The Church's views on the sinfulness of marital sex also evolved. Initially, some writers believed that all sexual intercourse, even in marriage, was sinful. However, by the 13th century, theologians and canonists began to see marriage and reproduction as positive, partly to combat the Cathar heresy, which held that all flesh was evil. They agreed that sex acts must be open to the possibility of conception to avoid sin. This did not mean that infertile couples could not have sex, but fertile couples were forbidden to use contraception. The use of contraception, despite being vilified by the Church, was still practiced. Medieval women used various herbs and methods to prevent pregnancy, including asarum, ferula, and birthwort. Some of these herbs could cause early-term abortions if taken in high doses, but they were also toxic. There were also barrier methods, such as sponges and pebbles, and some methods for men, like chaste tree and coriander, which were anaphrodisiacs. Jewish attitudes toward contraception were more lenient. While destroying seed was a serious offense, some rabbis held that women could use contraception if pregnancy would threaten their health, or if the woman was too young. However, contraception for economic reasons was not accepted, and reproduction was a central purpose of marriage. Islamic thought was more accepting of non-reproductive sex. Coitus interruptus was considered no worse than abstaining from sex, and a man could not practice it without his wife's consent. Muslim scholars believed that God determined whether a woman would become pregnant, and women had a right to sexual pleasure and children. Despite the Church's stance against contraception, it was practiced, and other factors, such as breastfeeding, also played a role in controlling birth rates. In the Middle Ages, most married people were more concerned with fertility than contraception. Aristocrats, peasants, and people of all social groups wanted to maximize the number of offspring, especially in an era of high infant mortality. In this historical context, The Church's views on marriage and sexual relations reflect a complex interplay of religious doctrine, social norms, and practical consideration. The evolution of these views over time shows how deeply intertwined religious, legal, and cultural factors were in shaping the medieval understanding of marriage and sex.